Before we begin, if you're listening right now, no matter where in the world you are, take a moment to share your time and place in the comments. Are you in New York or somewhere much further from the harbor? And if you find comfort in quiet stories that history left behind, tap subscribe. It helps this kind of work stay alive, and it brings you more stories you were never meant to forget. Asterisk, she stands quietly in the harbor. Her copper body has turned green with age. Her arm is stretched upward, holding a torch, but at her feet, where almost no visitor looks, lies broken chain, one link shattered, one message lost in time. You're probably familiar with the Statue of Liberty. She's appeared in textbooks, postcards, movies, even on cereal boxes, but almost no one talks about the chain at her feet. It's not mentioned in school books, not highlighted in tourist guides. And yet, it was one of the most intentional parts of her design. Not decorative, not random, but a protest. To understand the chain, we need to go back farther than Ellis Island, farther than the ships that passed beneath her. We go to 1865. The American Civil War has just ended. Slavery has been legally abolished. And in Paris, a Frenchman named Edouard de Laboulaye is watching the outcome with cautious hope. Laboulaye was not just any observer. He was a law professor, a writer, and a strong advocate for democracy. He admired Abraham Lincoln deeply. But Laboulaye also feared that liberty might be a fleeting thing, even in a country that had just outlawed slavery. He was worried not about the laws on paper, but about the spirit behind them. Would America live up to the ideals it claimed? He proposed a statue, gift from France to America, something to honor the recent end of slavery and to celebrate the shared democratic values between the two nations. But he didn't want a statue that was abstract or polite. He wanted it to say something unignorable, something that would make it clear that liberty wasn't just a word, was a responsibility. He brought the idea to a young sculptor, Frederick August Bartholdi. Bartholdi, like many artists, worked in symbols. He didn't want to carve long speeches into stone. He wanted symbols. A torch. Yes, a robe, like ancient Roman goddesses wore. A tablet, inscribed with the date of American independence. Kalea was one feature he insisted on, perhaps more than any other. A broken shackle at the statue's feet. A chain snapped. Bartholdi had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. He had seen the faces of enslaved people in Egypt while traveling there. He knew that symbols mattered. The broken chain was meant to represent the end of slavery. Yes, but more than that, it was a reminder of what liberty truly meant. Liberty was not something given. It was something fought for, and something easily lost. So he placed the chain, not in her hands, not proudly held aloft, but beneath her feet. It's trampled, left behind, and yet, always there. It's always visible. If you knew to look, the original plans for the statue were far more dramatic than what you see today. Bartholdi's early sketches showed the statue with the chain in full view. Sometimes it even occupied a central place in the design. But over time, especially as American financiers got involved, things began to change. Money was needed to build the pedestal, and money meant compromises. The statue became less about the abolition of slavery and more about a vague notion of freedom that was more palatable to the donors. Newspapers stopped mentioning the chain. Symbolism was softened. Even today, the National Park Service rarely highlights the broken shackle in its official materials. But the chain is there, still, left foot slightly raised, links splayed, rust never allowed to form, but weathered by silence. When the statue was finally unveiled in 1886, the country it faced was already retreating from Reconstruction. Black Americans who had briefly gained political power were being pushed out again. New laws were being written to circumvent their rights. Lynchings had begun to rise. And still, the statue stood, her feet planted on a broken chain no one wanted. To acknowledge why was the chain buried in meaning and left out of most conversations? It wasn't because it didn't matter, okay? It was because it mattered too much. Her torch symbolized enlightenment, okay? Her tablet, the rule of law. But her feet, they told the truth, okay? That liberty comes from breaking chains, not decorating over them. In the decades that followed, the statue would become an emblem of hope for immigrants, a symbol of welcome. But for many, especially those who had never been truly welcomed, the statue was a contradiction, a copper promise left unfulfilled. Still, the chain endured, not erased, just ... ignored. Now think of all the school field trips, the gift shops, the drone shots panning slowly over her shoulders, the medals and mugs. How often is the chain mentioned? How often is it cropped out? There's a quiet history beneath the symbols we claim to understand, and at the feet of the statue in that quiet place lies a broken link, a broken promise, or perhaps a permanent reminder. Was it ever meant to be seen, or was it always meant to be forgotten? Asterisk, the unveiling ceremony on October 28, 1886 was anything but quiet. New York Harbor was dense with boats, flags, and the smoky noise of gun salutes. President Grover Cleveland delivered a speech declaring the statue the mighty mother of exiles, though the famous Lazarus poem hadn't yet been added to her pedestal. Fireboats sprayed jets into the air. Thousands cheered, but very few. He mentioned the chain. The chain was there, of course, beneath the folds of the robe, under her left foot, partially visible if you stood close enough. But it was not mentioned in speeches, not included in the program, and not pointed out to the watching press. It's the symbolism of liberty, safe, poetic, uncontroversial, was praised again and again. But the evidence of bondage, of history's brutality, and its uncomfortably recent end, that was left to rust in silence, and that silence was not accidental. In the 2 decades between the end of the Civil War and the unveiling of the statue, America had entered what historians would later call the nadir of race relations. Freed, Black Americans had made enormous progress during Reconstruction, establishing schools, founding newspapers, even holding political office. But that fragile momentum was violently halted in the 1870s and 1880s. Reconstruction ended. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and in their absence, white supremacist laws and mobs returned. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, segregation codes, lynchings. By the time Lady Liberty lifted her torch in the harbor, the nation was already sliding backward. And so, the broken chain, once intended as a bold political symbol, became a liability, a reminder, statement many did not wish to hear. And so, quite simply, it was ignored. Bartholdi himself, who had once been insistent on its inclusion, grew quieter about its meaning. His public statements focused on the statue's architectural and engineering feats, the scale of the armature, the way the copper sheets had been hammered, its feat of assembling such a large structure in a nation not yet known for monumental sculpture. It was easier, safer, but that didn't mean the chain lost its voice. Quietly, others began to notice it, especially those who came to the statue with different eyes. In the 1900s, Black writers began to speak about the contradiction of the monument. W.E.B. Du Bois, the sociologist and civil rights activist, often pointed out that symbols of freedom in America rang hollow to those still denied it. In 1917, a silent protest of nearly 10,000 black men, women, and children marched down Fifth Avenue. They carried no signs, no drums, only a message. We march because we are treated as less than men. It's the chain at Lady Liberty's feet, though unspoken, was always there, a symbol too quiet to erase. Then came the World Wars. During World War I, The Statue of Liberty was used in propaganda posters. Her torch now, symbolic of unity and strength, was printed beside slogans urging enlistment and war bonds. The broken chain wasn't shown. It didn't fit. And once again, the country's own internal contradictions were pushed aside in favor of a single, heroic image. Asterisk, in World War II, the statue loomed even larger. Soldiers passed her in ships. Her silhouette was printed on ration booklets and recruitment leaflets. President Roosevelt referenced her in speeches. She became a beacon not just for immigrants, but for the nation itself. The pedestal received new plaques, but the chain remained unacknowledged, even when the statue began to turn green oxidation, changing the copper's color. By the 1920s, nobody polished the chain. Its green hue was eventually embraced. A cosmetic accident turned into aesthetic identity, but nobody asked whether the rusted chain might symbolize something else too. Not decay, but neglect. Asterisk, then, in 1956, came an event that forced people to look again. A small protest to overlook now was staged by civil rights activists who rode a ferry out to Liberty Island. They stood near the base of the statue, quietly holding signs that said, "America has not broken all the chains." It didn't make national headlines, but for those present, it was a reclaiming asterisk. Emma Lazarus's poem, "The New Colossus," had by then been affixed to the pedestal for decades. Its words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," were now inseparable from the statue's identity. But the activists asked, what about the masses already here who had never been free? And still, the chain lay at her feet. In the years that followed, artists and scholars began to resurrect the statue's deeper symbolism. Some sculptors created miniature replicas, placing the broken chain more prominently. Others wrote essays about the erasure of abolitionist meaning from national memory. And one detail became especially curious. The statue's left foot is slightly raised, not firmly planted. The left heel is lifted, as if stepping forward. A small movement, almost imperceptible. But it changes everything. It is not a woman passively standing on chains. It is a woman stepping away from them. That detail matters because it suggests motion, momentum. It turns a static statue into a story. But what is the next step? The foot does not lift high. The motion is arrested. A half step forward, frozen in metal. It's a promise of progress without completion. It's almost as if the sculptor knew that liberty would always be incomplete, always chasing, always slipping. And perhaps that was the point all along. The chain was never meant to be a relic of the past. It was meant to be a question for the present. Do we still break chains, or do we only decorate them? By the time the Statue of Liberty celebrated her centennial in 1986, she had become a contradiction wrapped in copper. President Reagan gave a televised speech beneath her torch, calling her the lady that lifts her lamp beside the golden door. Fireworks lit the sky. A barge parade floated past. New Yorkers waved flags. And on Liberty Island, crowds gathered to commemorate 100 years of symbolism. Yet again, the torch was praised, the poem was quoted, and the pedestal was polished. No one mentioned the chain. The silence had become tradition. That same year, a different kind of artist tried to make people look again. Black visual artist and historian Dred Scott created installations and street art pieces confronting the contradictions between American liberty and lived reality. He and others in the activist community began calling attention to forgotten symbols, like the chain at Lady Liberty's feet, as evidence of how public memory is curated, not by truth, but by comfort. Around this time, more scholars began re-examining the original purpose of the statue. They studied Laboulaye's letters, Bartoli's early sketches, the political climate of the 1860s and 70s. What they found was clear. The statue was conceived not just as a gift from France, but as an abolitionist monumental celebration of emancipation, the end of slavery, and the beginning of a democratic promise that needed to be kept. And yet, its origin story had been erased, muted, edited out of official guidebooks and public school textbooks alike. Instead, the story taught in classrooms emphasized immigration. And while that story is real, it is meaningful, it is not the whole story. The broken chain was never just symbolic. It was specific. It was about one of the greatest upheavals in American history, the forced labor of millions, and their struggle for personhood. That is why it sits, not in her hand or her crown, but at her feet. To walk toward freedom, one must first step over oppression. But even as that story was being rediscovered by historians, the statue itself remained unchanged. No new plaque was added to explain the chain. No exhibit pointed to its history. Visitors snapped photos from below, capturing the torch, the crown, the face, but few aimed their lens downward. The silence endured, and yet small gestures began to challenge that. A museum on Liberty Island was renovated. In one corner, a quiet display case was installed, a cast of the statue's foot with a broken shackle visible. No spotlight, no fanfare, but it was there, and visitors especially. Children began to ask questions. Why was there a chain? Who was it meant for? Why don't the brochures talk about it? Even now, if you walk around the base of the statue, you might catch a glimpse of the shackle. It blends into the folds of her robe. You have to know where to look. And when you find it, something strange happens. The statue changes. She becomes more than a monument, more than a landmark. She becomes a question, because once you see the chain, you begin to wonder what else was left out. The name Liberty enlightening the world. The statue's full original name sounds grand, but liberty for whom? Enlightenment from what? And what do we do with the symbols we inherit? The Statue of Liberty is many things to many people. To immigrants, she represents hope. To tourists, she's a photo opportunity. To students, she's a test question. To historians, she's a palimpsest monument rewritten by each generation. But to those who notice the chain, she becomes a reminder that liberty is never complete, even the torch. The most famous part of the statue has its own strange story. The original torch Bartholdi's design was replaced in 1984 with a new version encased in gold leaf glass. The old one, corroded and leaking, was placed in a museum. Many visitors don't know they're looking at a replica, but the symbol remains powerful, even when hollowed out. The torch, after all, is what draws the eye. But the chain is what demands you look inward. And maybe that's why it was left there, half buried, to remind us that every nation has stories it's proud to tell. Others it prefers to forget. That liberty is not a statue, or a poem, or a fireworks show. It's a choice, a tension, a broken link at someone's feet. And when we step past it without looking, repeat history not as tragedy or farce, but as FORGET, FULNESS. So next time you see a picture of the Statue of Liberty, look closer, zoom in, ask yourself, what else have we edited out of history? And are we still stepping over broken chains without seeing them? Asterisk, before Ellis Island became a museum filled with grainy photos and brass plaques, it was something else entirely. A gate. Not a door, not an open field, but a gate that sometimes stayed shut without warning, without reason, and without explanation. For millions, Ellis Island was the first piece of America they ever touched. Between 1892 and 1954, over 12 million immigrants passed through its inspection halls, dormitories, and processing rooms. And for most, the experience was brief. Few hours, a series of questions, a stamp, new life. But for some thousands, in fact, the island was not a passage. It was a pause, a delay, A lock with no key, and what happened during that waiting time is a part of history that rarely gets told. Most images of Ellis Island show movement, trains, ships, long lines of people with suitcases and babies in arms. But in the quiet corners of the facility, behind locked doors and screened-off sections, there were people who were simply ... stuck. Immigrants who failed a medical exam. Women whose husbands had not arrived. Children separated from parents. Refugees with unclear paperwork. Men whose names raised suspicion, but who hadn't done anything wrong. These people were not deported. Not yet, but they weren't allowed to leave either. Instead, they were held in limbo. Some 4 days, some for weeks, a few for months. They were given a bed, a number, and very few answers. The rooms were not cells, but they weren't homes either. They were filled with rows of iron cots, rough woolen blankets, and low, humming silence. The ceilings were high. The windows were barred, and the rules were rarely explained. Many called it the Island of Tears, but those who stayed longer than a few hours learned a different truth. It was the island of waiting. Waiting without clocks. Waiting without knowledge. Waiting without dignity. Doctors patrolled the halls. Didn't always speak the languages of the people they examined. Sometimes a chalk mark was made on a coat. H for heart trouble. X for suspected. Mental illness. L for lameness. These markings, often made in haste, sometimes in Arakud, mean immediate detainment. And once detained, it was hard to know what came next. There was no formal appeal system, no notice of rights. Families could write letters, but many didn't know where their loved one had gone. Translators were few. Legal aid was rarer still. Some relied on charity groups, women's aid societies, religious volunteers to help interpret the system. But the system was built not to inform, but to sort. And so people waited asterisks in dormitories, with names like Room 9 North or Detention Room. Some tried to pace the floor. Some stayed in bed all day. Others pressed their faces against the frosted windows, staring out toward Manhattan's skyline so close, it seemed they could almost reach it, but they couldn't. Many had already sold everything they owned for the journey. They had no home to return to. Their countries of origin were collapsing. Famine, pogroms, civil war. Returning meant more than disappointment. It meant danger. It meant death. And so they waited in a place where time didn't behave normally, because on Ellis Island, time was not measured by hours. It was measured by the sound of keys, the jingling of a guard walking past, asterisk, the creak of a hinge, the tap of a medical chart on a clipboard, and the silence that followed, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. To most Americans, Ellis Island meant hope. Teach meant the start of a family story. But to the people in the detention wing, it meant something else. It meant helplessness. There are stories of people who fell ill while waiting, of small children developing fevers, of elderly parents weakening on the same boat that had brought them. They had reached land, but not safety. And if the illness progressed, they were marked again. It's time for deportation. Sometimes a family arrived together, but left separated. A father was allowed through, but the mother failed inspection. The child clung to both. The officials chose. One story tells of a young Polish girl detained because she didn't speak. They thought she was mute or slow. In truth, she was terrified. She had never seen a building so large. She was only 8. She lost her shoes on the boat. Her silence became her sentence. Another story tells of a pregnant woman whose husband had settled in Chicago. Her papers were in order, but the officials decided she might become a public charge. She was held. Her child was born on the island. Born American, born behind a locked door, born under fluorescent light and surrounded by strangers. There were hundreds of stories like these. They rarely made the newspapers, They were not carved into bronze plaques. Tia, they are not taught in school assemblies about coming to America. They live in footnotes and in the memories of grandchildren who were told to not talk about it. But those stories are part of history too. They remind us that for many, the journey didn't end with the ship's arrival. It ended in a room with a cot and a ceiling too high to touch dot, and a lock with no key, no explanation, just time that forgot how to move forward. Asterisk. What do you do when no one tells you what day it is? This was the quiet crisis at the heart of Ellis Island's detention rooms. The people inside weren't criminals. They had broken no laws, but they were treated like shadows, part of a list, a file, a set of symptoms. And as they waited, the outside world moved on without them. There were nearly 40 buildings on Ellis Island by the early 20th century. The main building housed a great hall, where most immigrants were processed quickly. But behind it were wings and annex rooms without windows, corridors with long benches, and staircases that led to places with names like Psychopathic Ward and Board of Special Inquiry. The Board of Special Inquiry. It sounded like something official, almost dignified. But for many detainees, it was a room of confusion and fear. The board was made up of 3 immigration officials. No judge, no lawyer, just 3 men in suits, usually in a hurry. They sat behind the table and listened as translators, sometimes volunteers. Sometimes poorly trained, repeated a few hurried questions. Where are you going? What is your husband's name? How much money do you have? Are you feeble-minded? The answers mattered, but so did the pauses, the hesitation, the slowness of response, the crease in a forehead, the weariness in a voice. These could be misread as deception, or illness, or danger. And then came the decision. Some were cleared, some were deported, some were sent back to wait again. For those waiting, hope shrank with each hour. One man, an Armenian shoemaker, had spent weeks crossing Europe to reach the ship. When he arrived, a routine medical check suspected trachoma, contagious eye disease. He felt fine. He could say, explain this in broken English and hand gestures. But the doctor's chalk mark was already on his coat. He was placed in detention room, for he watched ships come and go. He saw families leaving the building, embracing on the docks, but his name wasn't called. Not that day, not the next. On the 7th day, he stopped speaking. On the 10th, he was deported. He never made it back to America. Some were luckier. Italian widow detained because she had no family to claim her in New York was eventually vouched for by a church charity. A young Russian man wrongly accused of anarchist sympathies was cleared after his cousin in Philadelphia sent a notarized letter. But these resolutions were rare and slow, and they required help that wasn't always available. Language was a constant barrier. Interpreters weren't fluent in every dialect, misunderstood entire testimonies. In one case, a young girl from Galicia was thought to be confessing to a criminal offense when, in truth, she had been explaining that her brother was a butcher. That mistake cost her 3 days in solitary holding. It nearly led to deportation. There were small indignities too. Food that made people sick. Thin blankets that did little against the damp chill of the island air. Loud boots on marble floors that woke babies in the night. And always the waiting. Some tried to write letters. The Red Cross helped deliver mail, but many addresses were incomplete. Families were on the move. Letters crossed in transit, or were lost entirely. There were telephones, but access was limited. Some detainees didn't know what a telephone was. Others didn't know the number to call. Time blurred. Women braided each other's hair to pass the hours. Children scratched. Games into the floor. Men stood at windows that didn't open, pretending to feel fresh air. One man, a Yiddish poet from Odessa, scribbled verses on the backs of old forms. His words were about birds that could not fly and clocks with no hands. No one remembers his name. His poems were never published, but his voice, like many others, lingers in silence. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act. This changed everything. Suddenly, immigration was no longer simply about arriving, it was about fitting into a category. National origin, race, class, literacy, employment, potential all were tallied and judged. Ellis Island's detention rooms became even more crowded. The Board of Special Inquiry grew more selective. The waiting grew longer. The silence grew heavier. You could sit for hours, hearing nothing but the creak of bed springs and the rustle of forms. And then, without warning, a name might be called. Some names were called softly, mispronounced, barely heard. Others were shouted and never answered because the person had given up waiting, had fallen ill, had curled into sleep too deep to wake from. And still, ships docked. Still, the ferries came. New arrivals looked up at the red-tiled rooftops of the island and saw hope. But behind those windows, others watched them with envy, wondering what made the difference. Sometimes the difference was money. Sometimes it was a missing paper. Sometimes it was a name that sounded wrong. Sometimes it was nothing at all. And that might have been the hardest part to bear. Not knowing why, not knowing when, not knowing if the key would ever turn. Asterisk by the late 1930s. The tides were turning both in history and around the docks of New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty still stood, torch raised, eyes fixed toward the Atlantic. But just behind her, Ellis Island was becoming something else. So no longer the hopeful threshold it had once been. The island was quietly turning into a place of detention, not for immigrants arriving, but for those already here. The quiet rooms, where families had once waited in anxious silence, became holding cells for deportees. The purpose of Ellis Island. It shifted. It had always been a place of judgment. Now, it became a place of removal. During World War II, this shift accelerated. Ellis Island was used to detain so-called enemy aliens, Germans, Italians, Japanese nationals, many of whom had lived in the U.S. for decades. Some were arrested in surprise raids. Others were swept up without formal charges. They were placed in the same buildings where children once cried for parents, where pregnant women had once clutched their bellies. Now, it was men in suits and slippers, professors, shopkeepers, gardeners. There were no trial dates posted. The war would end before some were released. And yet, for all the people who passed through, for all the stories now lost in the worn floors and aging records, Ellis Island never saw a monument to the ones who waited longest. No bronze plaque tells you who stayed in its detention room, be no marble statue lists the names of those mistakenly marked for deportation. No poem is written for the people who almost became Americans. Most of the names that passed through Ellis Island were logged. Roughly 65 million names recorded in ledgers, now digitized for genealogists and curious descendants, or for the detained, especially those never released. The record keeping was less precise. Some never appear in the logs at all. They arrived, they waited, and then, quietly, they were gone. Some were deported. Some died of illness on the island. Some disappeared into the bureaucratic fog of the era countries that no longer existed. Names that were never spelled the same way twice. Others, were simply turned away. There is a story, half remembered, of a young mother from Greece. She arrived with 2 children. Her husband had gone ahead to Ohio. When questioned, she could not produce the address. She knew the town, but not the street. She had the wrong spelling of the family name. She was detained. The children caught fever. One recovered. The other did. Not by the time the husband wired correct documents. It was too late. One child had been buried in a municipal grave near the shoreline. The mother, inconsolable, refused to eat. They let her go eventually, but she was no longer the same woman who had stepped off the boat. Her story, like so many, never appeared in the tourist brochures. By 1954, Ellis Island officially closed its doors as an immigration station. The final person processed was a Norwegian seaman named Arne Peterson. He'd overstayed his shore leave and was briefly held before being released. A quiet, unceremonious ending to a place that had shaped millions of stories. And then came silence. The buildings began to decay. Paint peeled, windows cracked, files were boxed and forgotten for decades. Ellis Island sat in a kind of historical limbo. It's like the people it once held. It wasn't until the 1980s that restoration began. The main hall was cleaned, exhibits were added, audio tours were created. The island reopened to the public as a museum, monument to immigration, to heritage, to hope. But even in that polished version, something was missing. The waiting, the stillness, the faces pressed against window panes, hoping to see a ferry with good news. The letters that never arrived. The guards who didn't answer questions. The translators who misunderstood. The mothers who wept in the dark. The poems never read. The keys never turned. There is a room in the museum now where visitors can sit and listen to oral histories. Stories told by people who came through Ellis Island, or whose parents did. But few of them speak of being detained. Fewer still speak of being denied. It's not the story people want to remember, and yet it's part of the truth. Because liberty, like immigration, was never as clean or as fair as the symbols suggested. Some passed through Ellis Island in a day, others passed through in dreams, and some never passed through at all. They were held, they were silenced, they were erased, and all that remains now is a building, some records, and a quiet echo of names never spoken aloud again. So, if you visit Ellis Island someday, if you walk those tiled halls or read the names etched into granite walls, listen closely in the silence between the tour guide's words. You may hear something else, not a voice exactly, just the faint sound of waiting and the unanswered question left behind by every person who sat in a locked room, wondering why didn't they let me in? Asterisk, before it was sacred, it was silent, the Liberty Bell heavy, cracked. Photographed endlessly, did not ring in the way most people imagine. It didn't toll at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, didn't echo across valleys or drown out cannons. In fact, it may not have rung at all on July 4th, 1776, because the Liberty Bell didn't become famous for how it sounded. It became famous for how it broke. And the strange thing is, it kept breaking long after it stopped ringing. But before all of that, before it was cracked, copied, cast in miniature, turned into a symbolite, was just a bell ordered by a committee in 1751. The leaders of Pennsylvania's colonial government commissioned a bell for the tower of the new state house in Philadelphia. They needed a way to call lawmakers to assembly. Nothing grand, nothing poetic, something loud. They ordered the bell from a foundry in Whitechapel, London. The instructions were practical. The bell should weigh about 2,000 pounds, be tuned in E-flat. And this part was unusual. It should have an inscription. That inscription was not chosen by revolutionaries. It came from the Bible. Leviticus 25:10. Proclaimed liberty throughout all the land, and to all the inhabitants thereof, was chosen not for independence, but for a different reason, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of William Penn's Charter of Privileges, a document that promised religious tolerance and local governance to the people of Pennsylvania. In other words, Liberty Bell's first purpose had nothing to do with America as we think of it now. It was a local bell, cast for a colonial building, funded by a legislature loyal to the British Crown, and yet, like many things in history, it refused to stay in its assigned place. when the bell arrived from England in 1752. It was hung in a wooden frame to test its sound. It cracked immediately. No one knows exactly how or why. Some said the metal was too brittle. Others blamed the transatlantic voyage. But either way, it was an embarrassment. The cracked bell was melted down and recast in Philadelphia by local founders John Pass and John Stowe. They tried to keep the original inscription. They succeeded, sort of. Their names were added under the verse. The bell was poured, cooled, polished, and rung again. This time it held dot, or at least it seemed to, but the tone was strange. Too sharp, not clean, so they melted it again. A second, recasting, a third version. The sound was still imperfect, but it was accepted. The bell was hung in the State House tower. It rang for legislative meetings, for public events, for funerals of prominent colonists. It was a working bell, not yet sacred, not yet iconic. And then, in 1776, something changed. The colonies declared independence. A document was signed. Contrary to myth, the bell did not ring as ink dried on parchment. In fact, the signing occurred over several weeks, and many witnesses report no dramatic bell toll. If anything, the bell remained quiet, because the city was in turmoil. British troops were advancing. The revolution was real but fragile. Later, retellings would paint the bell as a hero of that day. But that's a retrospective, myth, comforting, dramatic, and not entirely true. The bell did ring on July 8, 1776. The declaration was read publicly from the State House yard, but it was one of many bells that rang that day. And few people marked it as special. It was just a bell, an old one with a repaired crack. But as the years passed and the new nation grew, the bell remained. It saw yellow fever epidemics, war protests, and early political rallies. It was rung to mark anniversaries, to mourn fallen leaders, to honor treaties. And with each use, it aged. By the early 1800s. The bell was showing signs of stress again. Small fractures, hairline cracks, uneven vibrations. It rang less frequently until one day in the 1830s, it cracked again, not with a thunderous break but with a small jagged line that slowly lengthened over time. It wasn't until George Washington's birthday celebration in 1846 that the final visible crack rendered it unusable. Mid-ring, during the festivities, the bell fractured so deeply that it could no longer function. The sound stopped permanently, and in that silence, the bell began to transform. It was no longer used, but it was now remembered by abolitionists, by poets, by preachers and protesters. The crack became the message. They said the bell had rung for freedom and then broken, as freedom itself was still unfinished. And they were right. In a way, because by the 1850s, the Liberty Bell had a new life. Not as a musical object, but as a symbol. And that symbol, like the bell would, continue to crack in ways few people fully understood. So what does it mean when a bell that's supposed to proclaim liberty is always breaking? Was the bell ever truly whole? Or was it born to fracture again and again? Asterisk, by the time the 1830s arrived, the Liberty Bell was no longer just a piece of metal. It had become a mirror reflecting the contradictions of a country still arguing with itself about what liberty meant, though it hadn't yet earned the title. Liberty Bell, officially it, was still sometimes called the State House Bell, or the Old Bell. It began to draw the attention of a growing abolitionist movement. People were starting to realize that the verse inscribed on its shoulder proclaimed liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It didn't match the reality of a country still deeply entangled in slavery. That crack in the bell began to feel like more than just a structural flaw. It felt symbolic. In 1835, a small anti-slavery journal published in Boston used the bell as a metaphor. Not long after, the name Liberty Bell began appearing more frequently, first in abolitionist pamphlets, then in speeches, then in newspapers. It was as if the bell had found a new voice, precisely because it could no longer ring. The American Anti-Slavery Society adopted the bell as a kind of unofficial emblem. They printed its image on leaflets and handbills. In their eyes, the Liberty Bell had not failed. It had told the truth. It had cracked under the strain of a freedom not fully realized. Think of that for a moment. A bell designed to symbolize law and order had been reimagined as a protest. A quiet object had become a loud silence. Its absence of sound spoke volumes, and in that way, the Liberty Bell entered the bloodstream of American memory, not through patriotism, but through protests in the years leading up to the Civil War. The bell remained in Philadelphia. It was viewed now and then, admired in quiet ceremonies, but it was no longer rung. The final expansion of its main crack had been hastily drilled and widened to prevent further spreading. This repair left it entirely mute. Still, people came. School children stared at it. Veterans stood beside it. Poets described its silence in verses full of longing. And then, the late 19th century, something surprising happened. The bell began to move, yes, move, between 1885 and 1915. The Liberty Bell was taken on tour across the United States. It traveled by rail, stopping in major cities, where crowds gathered to see it like a relic of sainthood. People reached out to touch it. Some kissed it, others pressed babies' foreheads against its side, as if to absorb some historical blessing. But here's what few realized. Every time the bell was lifted, packed, transported, and displayed, it cracked a little more. Asterisk. Tiny fractures spread beneath its surface. Its edges dulled, support structure warped under its weight. Metal, dust, invisible to the eye, was left behind at every stop. The bell was breaking again, quietly, invisibly, but certainly it had once been broken by a hammer stroke or a poor alloy. Now it was being broken by adoration. In 1915, after its final journey to the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, engineers declared it unfit to travel further. The bell had become too fragile. It would remain in Philadelphia, never to move again. It was placed in a special glass pavilion beside Independence, tall, and that's where it rests now. Still, silent, revered, but in that stillness lies the deeper truth. The Liberty Bell's greatest legacy came after its silence, because the bell became more powerful, but it stopped speaking. Think about it. It didn't ring for the Declaration. It didn't chime for the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't toll during Lincoln's funeral. It has not sounded in over 175 years, but its image is everywhere. Postage stamps, political campaigns, civil rights marches, student protests, Olympic pins, corporate logos. The bell that cannot ring still resonates. In 1963, as the civil rights movement swelled, Martin Luther King Jr. referenced the bell's inscription in his I Have a Dream speech. He said, "Let freedom ring, ... double quotes, and millions believed it was ringing if, not with sound, then with action." The bell was invoked again in the 1970s during anti-war demonstrations, again in the 1980s in campaigns against apartheid, again in the early 2000s during debates about immigration, justice, surveillance, and equality. It had become a symbol for everyone who felt unheard, because the bell itself could no longer, speak. Its crack had become a chorus. Still, ... There's something haunting in all of this. The bell was meant to command attention, to call lawmakers into session, to ring out on public occasions. And it did that, briefly, but its true function emerged only when it fell silent. It had to be broken in order to be believed. So, what does that say about us? It's that we hear best what cannot speak. It's that we see symbols more clearly when they fall apart. It's that freedom itself is only recognized when it fractures. There's a quiet weight in that thought, like standing next to the bell itself, feeling its cold side, running your hand along the scar that never healed, and realizing maybe it was never supposed to. Asterisk walk beneath the bell. Today, beneath its wide, silent archend, you'll feel something that is hard to explain. It's not owl, exactly, not pride, not even sadness. It's something quieter, heavier, something like remembering the Liberty Dale rests in a pavilion of glass and stone across from Independence Hall. People queue every day to see it. They wait politely. They take pictures. They lean against guardrails. And when they finally reach its twin, they stand beneath the crack. They lower their voices, almost without meaning to. That silence is part of the ritual. And maybe that's fitting, because the bell is not a victory trophy. It was never a celebration. It was a tool built to sound alarms, announce assemblies, and carry meaning across empty air. But it couldn't survive the meaning we gave it. It cracked under the weight, and it stayed cracked. There have been no serious efforts to recast it, no campaigns to melt and forge a new one, no plans to repair it, because by now, everyone understands. The crack is the whole point, but the deeper irony, it was never supposed to be famous. During the Revolutionary War, it was hidden. In 1777, as British troops advanced on Philadelphia, local patriots removed the bell from the State House tower and smuggled it to Allentown, Pennsylvania. Why? Because they feared the British would melt it down for cannon shot. The bell spent months in hiding under the floorboards of a church. It didn't ring, didn't move. It simply waited, and that, too, is part of its story. The bell has always belonged to the waiting, to those on the edges, the overlooked. The not quite arrived. It was never the bell of triumph. It was the bell of hope interrupted, and the nation it came to symbolize has, again and again, struggled with that interruption, because liberty in America has always been conditional, always delayed, always promised more loudly than delivered. The bell tells that story. The crack is wide, almost deliberate. It runs up through the word liberty, as if to suggest that liberty itself has been compromised. Visitors ask if it could be fixed. Some wonder why it isn't simply replaced with a perfect version. But perfection was never the point. To repair the bell would be to erase the tension. To recast it would be to pretend we got it right the first time, but we didn't. And the bell won't let us forget that. It doesn't ring, but it speaks. It doesn't shine, but it draws light. It doesn't move, but it still travels through textbooks, symbols, speeches, protests, and quiet thoughts. It has shown up in places where liberty was least certain, carried on placards during the women's suffrage marches in 1913, printed on banners during the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, projected on screens during Tiananmen Square vigils, painted on walls in Gaza, Belfast, Johannesburg, etched on dog tags, coins, classroom posters, always cracked, never whole. And in that brokenness, a strange kind of power. It has become a relic of contradiction, of dreams, deferred, and dreams. Clung to, anyway. Perhaps that is what makes it American, after all. The bell has never matched the stories told about it. It didn't ring for independence. It didn't survive without damage. It wasn't originally called the Liberty Bell. Its inscription was borrowed. Its sound was flawed. Its fame was accidental, and yet endures. Not because it fulfilled its purpose, but because it outgrew it, because it held something the country still struggles to name, the discomfort of unfinished. Freedom, the Liberty Bell, is not finished. It is not fixed. It is not perfect. It is broken and beautiful in that brokenness. And maybe when people walk past it quietly, when they look up at that familiar wound in the metal, They're not just seeing history, they're seeing a mirror, because the real sound of a liberty isn't something you hear with your ears. It's the echo of a promise not yet kept, still waiting, still ringing, still ... unfinished. Asterisk. The first thing they saw was not the face, it was the torch, rising faintly through the mist as the ship creaked toward New York Harbor for millions of immigrants arriving in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Statue of Liberty was not a postcard image or a tourist attraction. It was a moment, a shape glimpsed through fog or rain, through blurred vision and salt-crusted eyelashes. After weeks or months at sea, some thought she was holding a sword. Others thought she was a saint. A few mistook her for a mourning figure, standing vigil over the ocean. But almost no one knew what she was supposed to mean, because there were no plaques, no brochures, no welcome speeches. There was just a copper woman taller than any building they had ever seen standing, alone on an island with a fire in her hand, and they had to guess. It's easy now to forget how confusing that arrival must have been. Today, we speak of Lady Liberty as if she was a well-known symbol, but for the people arriving in 1895 or 1906 or 1912, there was no shared understanding of her purpose. They came from villages and cities where statues looked different, where monuments were to kings or saints or soldiers. A woman with a crown and a torch meant very little to some. She looked angry. To others, she looked tired. And for many children, she looked like someone who might tell you to be quiet. There were passengers who thought she was the Queen of America. Others assumed she was an angel. One boy from Naples thought she was a warning that if you misbehaved in the new country, the giant lady would take you away. Because no one explained her, She wasn't part of the official welcome. She just stood there, watching. Asterisk. The newspapers didn't help much. In their countries of origin, most immigrants had never read about the statue. She had been dedicated in 1886, mostly as a gesture of friendship between France and the U.S., but that dedication had little meaning for a peasant farmer from Slovakia or a textile worker from Belarus. What they saw was a shape, and the shape meant what they needed it to mean. One woman from Hungary said years later, "I thought she was the mother of the world and that she would take care of us." Another woman from Bavaria, just 12 years old when she arrived, whispered to her older sister, "She looks like she's praying for us." But Lady Liberty wasn't praying. She was frozen in a single moment, torch raised, foot lifted slightly, eyes blank. She was not smiling. That face, modeled in part after classical Roman statues, held no warmth. It was meant to project resolve, seriousness. The French sculptor, Bertaldi, wanted her to embody reason, not mercy. But immigrants didn't know that. They read her face differently. Some feared it. Asterisk. Others loved it. Most just stared. And then came the movement, the bustle of disembarkation. The noise, the officials, the small white cards to be pinned to collars, the pressing of bodies toward ferries, the smell of salt, sweat, and kerosene, and the statue faded behind them. They did not visit it. They did not get to climb inside. For most, she was seen once from the deckhand, never again. But that single moment remained vivid. A woman from Poland recalled, "I saw her, and I felt that maybe my name would matter now." A man from Syria said, "I saw her, and I believed I would not be sent back." These were not reactions to symbolism. These were reactions to presence. They were not interpreting the meaning of a monument. They were reaching for comfort in something that seemed strong and still. But comfort was not guaranteed. Some were sent back. Some were detained. Some never saw their families again, and the statue remained silent. There is a quiet truth buried beneath all the official stories. The Statue of Liberty didn't mean liberty to everyone. To some, she meant fear to others, judgment to many, confusion. She became meaningful over time, slowly, through repetition, through stories, through reinterpretation. But in those first years, with those first eyes, she was something else entirely. A mystery, a guess, a flame in the fog. And sometimes, that's all people needed. Not clarity, not promises, just something large and unmoving. Standing alone between the water and the land. Asterisk, in the years that followed their arrival, many immigrants didn't talk about the statue. They had too much to do finding work, finding rooms, finding enough to eat. The copper woman faded into the background, replaced by city noise, factory hours, and the slow carving out of a life in unfamiliar streets. But somewhere, quietly, she remained, pressed into memory like a photo never to catch the shape in the mist. And over time, shape became a story. It's hard to trace exactly when the Statue of Liberty began to mean something universal to the immigrant experience. In its earliest years, she was not broadly celebrated by immigrants themselves. That shift came later, once they had begun to belong, or at least to survive. Once their children learned English. Once their names appeared in telephone books. Once they could look back at the crossing as a completed chapter. Then, and only then, did the torch begin to glow more brightly in memory. And so, the meaning of the statue was not something they were given. It was something they built. One memory at a time. They gave her new names. In Yiddish newspapers, she was sometimes called Die Freiheit Statue, the Freedom Statue. In Italian letters, she was referred to as La Grande Donna, the Great Woman. Greek Orthodox Christians thought she resembled an icon. Irish immigrants thought her robes made her look like a cloaked Celtic goddess. No one agreed exactly on what she was, but they all knew where she stood. One Ukrainian man wrote in his diary, "She stands like a question asking, what kind of man you will be in this new place?" For many, she represented the border between the old self and the imagined one, the person they had been on the boat in, the one they hoped to become. But that border wasn't always smooth. Some immigrants felt resentment, disappointment. They had thought, America would welcome them warmly. Instead, they found landlords who wouldn't rent to them, employers who wouldn't hire them, neighbors who mocked their language, their food. The statue had been silent during their arrival. She stayed silent in their hardship, and yet she was remembered because she didn't speak, because she didn't judge, because she stood there unblinking while everything else was uncertain. Sometimes silence is mistaken for indifference, but other times it becomes a canvas. And that's what Lady Liberty became, a canvas onto which people projected their needs, their fears, their questions, in tenement buildings and crowded walk-ups, in meatpacking warehouses and garment factories, in coal mines and fruit stands. People remembered the shape of that figure in the harbor. She did not smile. She did not wave. But she did not turn away either, and that meant something. Children born to those immigrants began to reinterpret the statue more freely. For them, she was a symbol in textbooks, a field trip destination, a backdrop in family stories. They grew up hearing, "We came here and saw her." And in that second generation, the symbolism began to take root. Songs were written. School plays were performed. Posters were printed, and by the mid-20th century, the Statue of Liberty was firmly embedded in America's self-image as that it always meant the same thing to everyone. But the early memories suggest otherwise. There was a Turkish seamstress who, in her old age, said she looked like a woman who had waited a long time. So I trusted her. A Portuguese fisherman recalled, "I didn't know who she was. She was the only person I saw before the shouting started." A Czech farmer wrote in a letter, "The big woman did not wave, but she stayed there, even when we were unsure. That was enough. What emerges from these recollections is not reverence, but reluctant familiarity. They did not adore her. They remembered her, and in remembering her, they gave her meaning. That's the strange thing about symbols. They do not begin fully formed. They are not created by sculptors or governments alone. They are finished slowly, by the people who stare at them long enough to see their own story reflected back. And sometimes, the meaning they find is not what the artist intended. Sometimes it is deeper, not patriotic, but personal. A light, not above them, but beside them. Not a promise, but a presence. Asterisk as the years passed. The memories of the copper woman grew quieter, tucked between stories of border crossings, factory work, and the slow adjustments of life in a new world. Most immigrants never saw her again. They didn't take the ferry back out to Liberty Island. They didn't pose for photos with her. Many never even mention her to their children. But that moment standing at the railing of a crowded ship, seeing her torch break through the haze remained, locked away in a part of the mind where sound and image float together without words. And eventually, that silence was inherited. Descendants began to ask questions. When did you come here? Did you see the Statue of Liberty? Was she beautiful? And the answers, when they came, were not poetic. She was taller than I expected. She looked cold. I was too tired to care. But sometimes, a story slipped through. I saw her, one grandmother whispered, and I knew I would never go back. That was the truth of her symbolism, not what she meant to America, but what she meant to one person, for one moment, in one crossing that changed everything. She was not a national icon then. She was not yet the mother of exiles. Emma Lazarus's poem had been written, but it had not been celebrated. Her words would not be mounted inside the pedestal until 1903, nearly 2 decades after the statue was unveiled. And even then, it would take decades more before those lines, "Give me you're tired, you're poor," are widely known at first. Lady Liberty stood without explanation, and maybe that's why people trusted her more, because she let them decide what she was in time. Her meaning hardened into schoolbook phrases, into museum captions, into granite certainty. But the early meanings were softer, stranger, more human. Some saw her as a judge, others as a protector. Some thought she was sad, few thought she might be lonely. One boy from Galicia remembered thinking, she is the first person in this country who doesn't ask me a question, 'cause once they passed her, the questions began. Name, age, country of origin. Do you speak English? Do you have money? Can you work? Are you fit? Had asked nothing. It had simply burned. And for some, that was mercy. But the story of the statue didn't end with arrival. It lingered. Years later, when immigrants became citizens. Some remembered her again, standing in a crowded room, holding a small flag. They might recall that moment at sea, the shape, the silence, the impossible size of her foot. They might feel just briefly that something large had once watched them enter this land, not to judge, not to welcome, but simply to witness. Others saw her again only in books or on coins. Her green patina faded in their memory. Her arm, once raised, now stiff and still. She became distant again this time, not by ocean, but by time. And yet, she remained theirs, because meaning does not stay where it starts. The people who built her meant her as a monument to shared Republican values France to America, a gift between governments, a nod to ancient ideals. But the people who saw her from ships, the people who misread her, feared her, blessed her, they gave her new purpose. They carried that meaning in them, sometimes proudly, sometimes wordlessly. Asterisk, they stitched it into the language they learned. They passed it into lullabies and mealtime prayers. They hid it inside names and neighborhood stories. They carved it into headstones, silently, and now, when visitors line up to see her, when they take photos, read plaques, or recite Emma Lazarus's poem, they're not only looking at a statue, they're standing inside the meaning. Someone else gave her a child from Lithuania, a mother from Sicily, a grandfather from Damascus, a sister from Shanghai. People who saw a woman in the harbor and didn't know her name but trusted her to be part of the life they hadn't lived yet, and in doing so, made her part of it forever. Asterisk. When the Statue of Liberty was first unveiled in 1886, not everyone applauded. Some people complained about the size, others hated the color. Many thought she was simply ugly. Newspapers in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and even overseas took turns mocking her features. Editorials described her nose as bulbous, her crown as awkward, and her torch as a futile gesture from a frozen figure. One headline reads simply, "Liberty's Monster." It might be surprising now, when she is considered sacred, to learn just how unpopular Lady Liberty was at the start. But the truth is, the statue was born not of consensus, but of doubt, and she had to survive ridicule before she ever became a symbol. To understand that, you need to go back a few decades before her dedication. The idea for the statue came from Édouard de la Ballée, French scholar and political thinker. In the early 1860s, he admired America's growing democracy and hoped France would follow its lead. After the end of the American Civil War, La Ballée proposed to gift a grand statue celebrating liberty and friendship between the two nations. Frederick Auguste Bartoli, the sculptor chosen for the task, imagined a woman draped in classical robes, holding a torch, wearing a crown. He envisioned her rising from the harbor, a modern colossus of Rhodes. But almost immediately, Americans had questions. Why a statue? Why from France? Who would pay for it? The deal, as proposed, was that France would build the statue itself, while the United States would construct the pedestal. And that's where the trouble began. Nobody wanted to pay for the pedestal. Congress dragged its feet. Wealthy donors didn't see the point. Editors questioned whether America needed such a gesture. In fact, many felt the statue was more about French ego than American pride. One paper mocked, "Let the Frenchmen display their liberty in their own harbors. We need factories, not female giants." When Bartholdi sent the torch-bearing arm to the United States in 1876 for the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, it was met with curiosity, but not reverence. People climbed up into the torch, took in the view, and left. There was little sense of national meaning attached to it. Then came the artist's critiques. The arm was considered too stiff. The proportions felt wrong. When the full head arrived later in New York, critics described it as matronly and severe. Some thought the eyes were hollow. Others didn't like the shape of her jaw. One editorial compared her to a disappointed schoolteacher. And then, of course, there was the issue of color. The statue, made of copper, began as a deep reddish brown, but within years it began to oxidize, turning first chocolate, then muddy, and eventually the green-blue patina we know today. People were appalled. Letters poured into newspapers, wondering if something was wrong. Was the statue diseased? Was she rusting? Why hadn't they used better materials? Newspapers published cartoons mocking her transformation. One drew her with patches of moss growing from her face. Another showed her sinking into the harbor, one arm still outstretched in silent confusion. Public figures weighed in. Architects said she was poorly designed. Painters said she lacked grace. Poets ignored her entirely. Even some immigrant groups found her off-putting. "She looks like she judges," one letter said, "but we have not yet spoken." The pedestal construction was halted multiple times for lack of funds. At one point, there was talk of storing the statue parts in a warehouse indefinitely. And then, something unexpected happened. Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper magnate, launched a fundraising campaign not to defend the statue's aesthetics, to defend the idea of completing it at all. He offered to print the name of any donor, no matter how small the amount, in his paper, The New York World. His call was simple: let the people pay for the statue. And they did. Pennies came in from schoolchildren. Quarters arrived from dock workers. Small envelopes, handwritten, with stamps barely clinging to the edges. The campaign raised over $100,000 in just a few months, enough to finish the pedestal. But the critics remained. Even after her full assembly in 1886, many described the statue as underwhelming. Some said she was too stiff. Others complained the tablet looked awkward in her hand. Many were surprised by how still she seemed. She's not walking forward. One artist noted, she's stuck mid-step, okay? And yet, she stayed. Not because she was beautiful, not because she was loved, but because people, ordinary people, had paid for her. They had made her real, even if they didn't like her. So what happens to a statue that people don't admire? Can it still become a symbol, or does it grow slowly, awkwardly, into something more? Asterisk, the year was 1886. The pedestal was finally complete. The scaffolding came down. The enormous copper woman, over 300 feet from heel to torch, stood ready on Bedloe's Island. And still, the reviews were mixed. The official dedication ceremony on October 28th was grand, loud, foggy, and strangely uncertain. President Grover Cleveland delivered a speech. Boats filled the harbor. Cannons fired, but the statue was barely visible through the mist. And as the celebrations ended, the critiques returned. The New York Times printed one of the candor assessments, calling the statue impressive in scale, if not in subtlety. Harper's Weekly was harsher. Liberty, it seems, has little elegance. And the Boston Globe offered, she appears more tired than triumphant. Artists disliked her lack of fluidity. Writers called her emotionally blank, and the public mostly shrugged. The statue stood alone, across the water, not easily reached by ferry. There was no museum, no visitor center, no postcard stand. For years, she simply stood there, stiff, unchanging. A greenish figure, ignored by many and mocked by others. She wasn't even lit properly. One of the biggest complaints in the years after her unveiling was the failure of the torch's illumination. The idea had been that the torch would serve as a literal beacon guiding ships, lighting the harbor. But the early electrical system was weak. The torch barely glowed. Many said it looked like a dim oil lamp held by a sleepwalker. Papers joked that Liberty is afraid of the dark. Engineers tried to improve it. They added searchlights, experimented with mirrors. Nothing worked well. The torch remained a disappointmenta, symbol that wouldn't shine. And so, for a time, the Statue of Liberty became ... background. Not hated, not beloved. It's just there. A weathered structure slowly turning green. A woman nobody quite understood. But something else was quietly happening. As immigrants continued to arrive in waves through the 1890s, the 1910s, the 1920s, they began to attach new meaning to her. Not because she was beautiful, not because she was explained, but because she was seen for many. She was the first human-shaped figure they spotted in America that mattered more than art criticism, more than poor lighting, more than bad press. Slowly, through immigrant stories, school recitations, and local lore, the statue's meaning evolved. Children began drawing her in classrooms. Poets began invoking her in verse. Photographers experimented with her angles. Her silence was reinterpreted as solemnity, her stiffness as strength, her ugliness as endurance. And then came the poem. Emma Lazarus had written The New Colossus in 1883 to help raise funds for the pedestal. At the time, it was hardly noticed. She died 2 years later, never seeing the statue completed. But by the early 20th century, her words resurfaced. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Printed in pamphlets, read at ceremonies, whispered at Ellis Island. In 1903. The poem was mounted on a bronze plaque inside the pedestal, not on the torch, not on the crown. Inside, almost hidden, but from that quiet corner. The words spread. They reframed the statue. Now, she wasn't just a gift from France. She was a mother, a guardian, a promise, not to the elite, but to the desperate. Suddenly, the critics faded. The focus turned to symbolism. And symbolism, unlike sculpture, cannot be measured in angles and expressions. Symbolism grows with use. By the 1930s, she was appearing on postage stamps. By the 1940s, she was drawn into war bond ads. By the 1950s, she was printed on school notebooks, bus passes, and cereal boxes. She had become beautiful, not by design, but by devotion. People had loved her into meaning, even her faults, the crack in her torch, the severe lines of her face, the strange posture were reimagined. She is not delicate. One writer said in 1951, because liberty never is. But underneath that praise, early skepticism remained buried in old newspapers and forgotten editorials, proof that symbols are not born flawless. They are wrestled into place. And maybe the fact that she was unloved at first makes her more honest, because liberty itself is often uncomfortable, often unwanted, often misunderstood. And yet, Kate stands green with time, silent with stories, uninvited but undeniable. Asterisk. By the middle of the 20th century, no one called her ugly anymore, not because her features had changed, but because the country had changed around her. The nation had weathered wars, depression, protest, and reinvention. And through it all, the copper woman in the harbor stayed in place, moved, unbroken, and slowly growing into the shape of something beloved. She had not earned that love through charm. She had earned it through survival. But her face stern, unmoving, slightly imbalanced, still told the story of her early days, when people weren't sure if they wanted her at all. The early cartoons had faded, but their skepticism echoed faintly in every tourist's hesitation when they looked up and whispered, "She's not smiling." And maybe that was part of it, because Lady Liberty was never meant to be comforting. Bartholdi didn't sculpt a muse. He sculpted a warning. She is tall, yes, is proud, but also watchful. Her brows are furrowed, her mouth straight, her eyes cast not downward in welcome, but forward in expectation. She does not lean. She does not bend. She expects you to meet her gaze. Even her torch, so often thought of as a beacon, is not extended to embrace, but held high and away, as if lighting a path that others must walk alone. She does not show the way. She illuminates what lies ahead. That posture is what critics disliked in the 1880s. It felt unfeeling, cold, not what they wanted from a national figure. But over time, that coldness became a kind of truth. Liberty is not gentle. It is not decorated, does not flatter. It waits, and sometimes it judges, even as it welcomes. By the 1960s, civil rights leaders stood beneath her and pointed out the distance between her promise and the country's reality. They did not ask her to be more beautiful. They asked her to be more honest. They invoked her image while marching on Washington, while crossing bridges in Selma, while sitting at lunch counters. They called on the symbolism that had once been dismissed as awkward and unconvinced, used it to ask, again, what liberty really looked like. By the 1970s and 1980s, immigrants from new corners of the world, Cambodia, Haiti, Iran, El Salvador, began to imagine her in their own terms. They didn't need her to be perfect. They only needed her to be there. And there she was. Still, the pedestal now includes plaques. The museum includes exhibits. Visitors learned that her skin is copper, her frame is iron, and her flame was once replaced. They read about Bartholdi, about France, about the fundraising, about Lazarus's poem. But most of them don't know that when she first arrived, people laughed at her, or ignored her, or argued against her presence entirely, because, by now, she feels inevitable, as if she's always been here, as if her meaning was clear from the start. But at WASN's, single quotes, it was debated, mocked, dismissed, and then slowly, steadily, stubbornly woven into the fabric of national memory. Her beauty was not sculpted, it was believed into being. Each generation added a layer, through poems and photographs, through pilgrimages and protests, through textbooks and t-shirts, through ferry rides and postcards, through loss and return. Now, children stand in her shadow and say, she's America. But perhaps she's something older, something harder. Perhaps she is not America as it is, but America as it promises to be. Not soft, not welcoming in the way we wish, but firm, present, watching, not inviting us in but daring us to live up to her. Asterisk, when you look at the Statue of Liberty, your eyes are drawn upward to the crown, to the torch, to the solemn, unreadable face, but the real message is at her feet. Bartholdi, the sculptor who designed her, did something quietly defiant, something most people never notice. He gave her one raised foot, one heel lifted, one toe extended. As if caught mid-step, she is not standing still. She is walking forward, and beneath that step, a broken shackle, snapped chain. It's one of the only parts of the statue not easily visible from below. Most people miss it. They always have, but Bartholdi did not. He placed it there carefully, intentionally, because he knew the message wouldn't be welcomed by everyone. The truth is, the Statue of Liberty was born of a protest, not just a celebration of liberty, but a critique of slavery, oppression, and authoritarian rule. The foot tells that story not with words, but with motion. A woman in a robe steps over chains, not stands on them, not kicks them aside. She steps forward, and that movement, however subtle, was the real rebellion. To understand why, you have to go back to France in the 1860s. Edouard de la Boulaye, the political thinker who first proposed the idea of gifting a statue to America, not merely admiring the U.S. from afar. He was watching France crumble under the weight of Napoleon III's authoritarian regime. He wanted France to become a republic, again like America claimed to be, and he hoped that by honoring American liberty, he could nudge France toward its own democratic revival. Bartholdi, the artist chosen to design the statue, was deeply influenced by this idea. He had seen tyranny firsthand. He had traveled to Egypt, watched workers toil under harsh conditions, and witnessed how grandeur often masked cruelty. So, when Bartholdi was asked to create a symbol of liberty, he didn't imagine something serene. He imagined something moving, something rising, something freeing itself. He didn't want a goddess on a throne. He wanted a woman who had been bound, was now unbound. That's why he placed the broken chain at her feet, and that's why he gave her that lifted heel. But as the statue's construction advanced, and as American financiers and committees got involved, that symbolism began to disappear from public discussion. The torch and crown were emphasized. The tablet with the declaration's date was praised. The poem by Emma Lazarus was later embraced. But the chains, they were quietly cropped out. They weren't removed. Bartholdi refused to do that. But no guidebooks mentioned them. No speeches pointed to them. No journalists photographed them, because the country receiving the statue, America, was still deeply uncomfortable with the story those chains told. The Civil War had ended only 2 decades earlier. Reconstruction was collapsing. Jim Crow laws were being drafted. Lynchings were rising. And the promise of liberty for all was unraveling. To highlight the broken chains at the statue's feet would have been to force a conversation no one wanted. So instead, people looked up. They admired the torch. They praised the crown. They ignored the step. But the step was the message in classical sculpture. The lifted heel signifies something powerful. It breaks symmetry. It signals change. It implies motion. And motion, in political art, is dangerous. Motion means resistance. Bartholdi gave liberty that resistance. She was not static. She was not passive. She was becoming. And in doing so, she became more than a symbol. She became a question. Where is she going? What has she left behind? What chains are we still stepping over? Asterisk. When the Statue of Liberty was first assembled on Bedloe's Island in 1886, no one mentioned the chains. There were speeches, flags, fireworks. Navy ships lined the harbor. President Grover Cleveland called her a gift of friendship from France. Dignitaries applauded. But not a single voice pointed to the broken shackles at her feet. Not even Bartholdi, the sculptor, stood there silently, watching as his creation was unveiled, knowing that the very part of the statue meant to speak. The loudest had been made invisible by silence. He had sculpted the chains with care, the right foot partially lifted, about to step over the broken link. The metal, twisted, bent, open. A representation not of abstract freedom, but of emancipation, of shackles broken by force, by revolution, by movement. And yet, the statues. American sponsors had little interest in that message. They were not abolitionists. They were financiers, political elites, roadmen, industrialists. Their interest in liberty was conceptual, something about markets, sovereignty, national pride. The symbolism of chains at a woman's feet felt dangerous, subversive. It's too closely tied to the messy, unresolved question of race in America. So they buried it. Not physically, but publicly. Photographs were taken from above, from the front, from the side, but not from the angle that would reveal her feet. Guidebooks left it out. Pamphlets ignored it. Porters had no comment. And so, over time, it became common knowledge that the statue stood still, not moving, not stepping, not breaking anything. That narrative remained intact for almost a century, even as millions passed through Ellis Island and looked up at her face. Few looked down. Few saw the motion. Few noticed the defiance. But the chains remained. You can see them even now if you visit Liberty Island and circle the base. If you stand just at the right angle and squint through the folds of her robe, you'll see the shackle. One half broken, the link split, and lying in the folds of draped copper. It's there, waiting. The National Park Service didn't mention it prominently until the late 20th century. Even then, it was listed as a little-known detail, as if it were a decorative flourish rather than the sculptor's original point. But Bartel never called it Little Dot in early sketches. He emphasized the chains in one, their front and center, clearly broken, clearly central to her meaning. In another, the woman stands barefoot, her heel planted on a ring of snapped metal, but that design was softened over time, bit by bit. The statue became less radical. The movement in her foot was preserved. The chain remained but tucked beneath a flowing robe, behind layers of bronze. Symbolism, and yet, the message survived, quietly, in a nation still struggling with freedom. The most powerful symbol of liberty was a woman stepping over chains we were not meant to see. That is protest. Not shouted, but sculpted. Not chiseled into scent. Monuments of victory. But hidden where only the careful will find it. That protest grew bolder in time. In the 1960s, civil rights leaders began to reclaim the statue. Activists pointed to the chains. They brought them back into conversation. Black artists painted the statue stepping fully forward, sometimes with flames rising behind her, sometimes with shackles more visible than copper folds. They said, "Look again," and slowly. the country did. Bartholdi's silent rebellion was rediscovered, not by scholars first, but by the people who had always known what broken chains looked like: immigrants, descendants of slaves, workers, mothers, marchers, people who understood that liberty is not a statue, it is a step, and that foot, that heel lifted from the ground. That's not decoration, that's revolution. Paused, waiting for the rest of us to follow. Asterisk today. Millions walk beneath a shadow, eyes tilted skyward. They photograph the crown, the torch, the robe, the grandeur, but few pause at her feet. Fewer still know what they're looking at. And yet, beneath the drapery, there it is, a chain, snapped, bent, left behind, and a foot mid-step leaving it behind Frederick. Auguste Bartholdi never explained it in detail. He didn't issue a formal statement, but he didn't have to. Artists speak in choices, okay? And this choice, this one raised foot, was not ornamental, it was political. The lifted foot is rare in statues of this scale. Most monuments stand firm, planted, secure, frozen in symbolic posture, but not this one. The Statue of Liberty was never meant to stand still. She was meant to move. And what is she moving away from? It's not simply tyranny, but bondage. In a letter from 1875, Bartholdi alluded to the importance of liberty, not just as an ideal, but as a liberation from chains that still darkened the modern world. He didn't name American slavery outright, but the subtext was clear. This was post-Civil War. Reconstruction was underway and already unraveling. Bartholdi and Laboule both saw this moment as precarious. Their statue was meant to say something before the silence returned, but America wasn't ready to hear it, even now. The official interpretation rarely mentions slavery. It's a plaque at the base, quotes Emma Lazarus. The guides talk about immigration. The museum displays photographs with the broken chain, the lifted foot. Still, it's mostly ignored, and yet something strange has happened in recent years. The step has become a subject of study. Academics have begun to write about it. Historians have drawn attention to it. Artists have magnified it in sculpture, painting, performance, a quiet recentering of the symbol, not by changing the statue, but by restoring what was always there. The broken shackle has been ripped. Me, 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 we, me, 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 we, me, and my, me and I, we, I, me, as a detail, but as the beginning, because everything else rises from that act. You cannot carry a torch until you free your hands. You cannot hold a tablet until your arms are unchained. You cannot walk forward until you step past what once held you still. That step is the start of liberty, and it still hasn't landed. That's the unsettling brilliance of Bartholdi's choice. The foot is lifted, but not placed. The movement is begun but not completed. It holds us in that moment. In the tension between freedom proclaimed and freedom practiced, we are still in that space, because broken chains are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of responsibility. And when a statue moves, even slightly, it invites us to ask, what have we left behind? What have we failed to step over? What chains still remain half hidden, half denied? The Statue of Liberty is not finished, not because of corrosion, not because of weather, but because the work she symbolizes is not done. Her step waits for us in every march, in every vote, in every reckoning. It waits in textbooks that still omit too much, in headlines that still ask the wrong questions, in policies that still favor the crowned over the chained. She waits, and we, too, are mid-step. History is not made by statues. It's made by people who see the parts of statues that others were told to ignore. So next time you see her, look down, find the foot, find the chain, and ask yourself, what are we still stepping over and who is still being asked to wait? Asterisk, they arrived by the dozens, small, tired, alone, their shoes worn down, coats borrowed or too thin. Some had tags tied to their sleeves. Others held folded notes. Many didn't know their real names. They came not with families, but from workhouses in New York. To them, it was not a land of freedom. It was a land of fear. In the decades following the Great Famine, tens of thousands of Irish children made their way to America. Some were accompanied by guardians, others by siblings. The many arrived as orphans or half-orphans, sent across the Atlantic by British poor law unions and Irish charities, desperate to offload the burdens of the destitute. They were not greeted with brass bands. There were no family members waiting at the docks, only inspectors, social workers, agents from orphanages and asylums, and sometimes no one at all. And so began the strange chapter of the Irish orphan migration, a movement that was not entirely voluntary, not entirely kind, and not entirely remembered. The children were usually between 6 and 14. They had names, sometimes misspelled, birthplaces, sometimes guessed, often fabricated for the sake of paperwork. Many had been placed in workhouses after losing one or both parents to typhus, fever, or starvation. In the workhouses, they had shared crowded dormitories, worn institutional clothing, and eaten just enough to survive. Their futures, if they stayed, were grim years of servitude, early death, or the streets. So, in the eyes of administrators, America was a solution. They would be shipped to a new land, given new lives, new homes, perhaps even new identities. But for the children, it was not that simple. Many didn't understand what America was. They boarded ships from Liverpool or Cork or Belfast, sometimes clutching small metal tokens, sometimes given prayers whispered in dialects they barely understood. The voyage across was long, damp, confusing. They slept below deck in steerage, often seasick, often alone, and when they finally reached New York, they passed under the looming shadow of Lady Liberty, though they did not know her name, and rarely looked up. What they saw, instead, were men with papers, women with clipboards, language they didn't speak, in rooms that reminded them too much of the ones they had just escaped. The fear came quickly, because even in America, the word workhouse followed them. It was whispered in new accents. It was written on their forms. It was muttered by guards, nurses, matrons. They were labeled as paupers, as charity cases, as unaccompanied minors of suspect origin. In the institutions in New York, though better fed and better funded, often looked, felt, and behaved just like the ones in Dublin or Limerick. Many of the children were taken directly from the immigration. Stationed 2 orphanages run by Catholic or Protestant charities. Some were placed with foster families through systems that would later evolve into the orphan train movement. Others were kept in city-run almshouses until anyone claimed them. Their names were changed, their records lost, their accents scrubbed out, but the memory of the workhouse remained. You could see it in the way they folded their clothes before bed, in the way they avoided eye contact when adults entered a room, in the way they never asked for seconds, even when the food was good, because they knew what it meant to be unwanted. In New York, though paved with opportunity for some, felt to them like a place where being small and alone meant starting at the very bottom again. There are scattered accounts from matrons and social workers in the 1870s and 1880s brief. Bureaucratic entries. Child arrived from County Clare. Could not. State name of village. Shy. Tearful. Refuses to eat unless instructed. Girl, aged approximately 9. Said to be fleeing poorhouse. Prod by ship captain. No sponsor on record. Rarely do these entries include names. Rarely do they mention what happened next. Some of the children thrived. Many disappeared into the churn of city life. Some vanished entirely. One girl, age 11, was briefly famous after escaping from a holding center on East 10th Street. She had come from a workhouse in Kilkenny. She ran barefoot through the city for 2 days before being caught trying to sleep in a stairwell. When asked why she ran, she said only, "I didn't come all this way for another place with locks." Others were adopted into families who renamed them, reshaped them, and never spoke of where they came from, because to admit that a child had arrived from a workhouse was to admit to poverty too deep to imagine. And America was trying to believe in the idea that all children could begin anew. So the past was erased, but not for the children, not for the ones who, decades later, would still flinch at certain words: inspection, ration, lie. Not for the ones who passed on to their own children a vague sense that something awful had happened across the sea. Not for the ones who, when asked where they came from, said only, "A place I don't go back to." Asterisk. New York was supposed to be different. The ships had carried them across an entire ocean to escape the smell of lime-washed floors, the sound of iron gates closing at dusk, the long corridors lined with cots and coughing children. The workhouses had marked them as burdens, as mouths to feed, as statistics in charity ledgers. But for many Irish orphans, the first breath of New York smelled familiar, coal smoke, boiled cabbage, wet brick, and the buildings they entered with their plain uniforms, gray blankets, and strict rules did not feel like freedom. They felt like repetition for administrators and reformers. This wasn't cruelty. It was charity. It was order. It was rescue. They spoke in the language of assimilation, a chance at a new life, a home for every child, cleanliness, obedience, purpose. But for the children, these were new words for old fears. One orphan girl, about 10 years old, wrote in careful, broken script, "We changed ships. Then we changed clothes. Then they said we were safe." But it was the same kind of walls. She was placed in an orphanage on the Lower East Side, run by a religious order whose discipline was strict and affection rare. Children were lined up in silence. Older girls were put to laundry duty. Boys were trained in trades, cobbling, carpentry, or street sweeping. Some children cried only at night when the dormitory lights went out and the adults were too tired to yell. Others didn't cry at all. They had already learned not to. In the 1870s and 80s, the number of Irish orphans arriving in New York began to raise concerns. Newspapers ran anxious headlines: "Invasion of pauper children from the Isles," and "Are we importing misery?" There were fears, sometimes whispered, sometimes printed, that these children would overrun the slums, burden the public systems, and breed dependency. It didn't matter that they were children. It didn't matter that many were already traumatized. They were seen as evidence of some larger failure of the Irish themselves, of Britain's policies, of America's open ports. And so, more pressure was placed on orphanages to shape these children into something respectable. That often meant erasure, erasing their names, their accents, their memories. Many orphan girls were renamed Mary or Catherine. Boys became James or John or Thomas. Surnames were anglicized. Regional dialects discouraged. Gaelic discouraged entirely. If a child whispered an Irish phrase at bedtime, another might hiss, "They'll hear you," because speaking like where you came from meant punishment. So they learned to be silent, to follow the rules, to fold laundry neatly, to keep their heads down. But memory doesn't vanish just because it's not spoken. It lingers in how one holds a spoon. Who, in the way hands tremble during hymn practice. Key, in the way eyes dart when someone says, inspection today. Key, even the city's architecture could trigger memory. Tenement buildings in 5 points, in Hell's Kitchen dark, crowded. K filled with noise, reminded some children of the wards they had left behind in County Clare or Cork. One boy told his caregiver, "This house smells like my other life." He was 7. Some were lucky, placed in homes with kind foster parents, given small corners of kindness, a coat that fit, a story read aloud, a toy that wasn't shared. But even these children carried the workhouse inside them. Many hoarded food. Some slept with shoes on. Others apologized every time they entered a room, because they had come from a system designed to remove individuality. It had landed in a city that only rewarded it if you erased your origins. One nun wrote in a private journal, "These Irish children are wary of joy. They do not believe in permanence. When I ask them what they want to be, they answer, quiet. Quiet was safer. Quiet was invisible. Quiet kept you from being sent back, because that was still a fear." Some children were threatened with deportation. They misbehaved. Others were warned that if they failed to adapt, they might be returned to the old country. They did not know what that meant if it was a bluff, a metaphor, or a real danger, but they feared it all the same, and so they tried. They smiled in photographs. They sang the songs they were taught. They stood in line for bread without complaint. But the workhouse was still there, beneath the uniform, beneath the English words, beneath the forced posture, not visible to the public, but visible to each other. One girl, age 9, once whispered to a younger boy on his first night in the dormitory, "This place is better than before, but we don't trust it yet." It was the best she could offer. Not hope, just honesty. Asterisk, by the early 1900s. Most of the Irish orphan migration had slowed. Immigration policy had begun to tighten. Steamship companies were more cautious. And the poor law system in Ireland had shifted priorities. Fewer children were sent abroad, but those who had already come, those who had spent their first years in America inside institutions, orphanages, boarding houses, or unfamiliar homes, remained. They grew up. Some married. Some moved west. Some joined factories or fire departments, or disappeared into the quiet anonymity of city life. But the workhouse never entirely left them, not even decades later. There are letters from adults in the 1930s now, in their 50s or 60s, writing to state agencies, trying to locate records from their childhoods. Most were met with polite refusals. The files had been lost. Names had changed. Birthplaces were unclear. Some were told, simply, "No such child listed under that name." Imagine that. Arriving in a country as a child, raised under a different name, told not to speak your mother's tongue, and then 50 years later, being informed that you never officially existed. It wasn't malice. It was neglect, administrative fog, system not built to remember. And so, many of the Irish orphans who had once feared New York carried those shadows into adulthood. Some kept their past a secret from their own children. Others invented better stories. A few wrote diaries, but never shared them. There is one account of a woman named Nora, who came over at age 8 from a Limerick workhouse. She was placed in a Protestant girls' home in the Bronx. She worked as a domestic servant, eventually married, and raised 3 sons. Her grandchildren say she never once spoke of Ireland. Not once. They found a trunk in her attic after her death containing a child's spoon, a thin wool scarf, and a page torn from a hymn book written in Gaelic. That was her whole archive, just a fragment of a life too painful to carry openly. The shadow of the workhouse stretched far not because the institutions followed them, but because the feeling did not, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of not belonging. The feeling that safety was always temporary. Even those who found happiness later in life often admitted quietly in late-night conversations or letters. They never said that they had never felt entirely American. They had been let in, but not welcomed, not fully. They had learned the customs, taken the oaths, paid the taxes, but something inside them still waited for the day the rules would change again. That is the legacy of institutions built to erase people. You can take the child out of the workhouse, but to silence the long beds, the numbered spoons, the rationed praise dash stays. It shows up in small ways, in the careful folding of shirts, in the way a grown man hesitates before asking a question, in the way a grandmother still hides food in the cupboard, just in case, in the fear that comfort is always temporary. In the city, it forgot them. The records were boxed up, the dormitories repurposed, the orphanages renamed, some torn down. There are no plaques in Manhattan for the Irish orphans who arrived without parents and rebuilt themselves from nothing. No statues of the frightened child who stepped onto American soil with nothing but a piece of string holding his jacket closed. But you can still find traces, not in the landmarks, but in the habits, in the way an old neighborhood church still serves tea after Mass, in the names stitched into old school yearbooks, in the way some families, generations later, still whisper about a great-grandmother who just appeared one day in New York. They were not stories told out loud. They were stories carried quietly, like the workhouse itself. Not a place anymore, but a weight. Asterisk, it always began the same way. A ship docked, a name was asked, a form was filled, somewhere on a worn desk, with a tired hand and a fountain pen running drier, name was changed. Not out of malice, but out of impatience, or misunderstanding, or carelessness, or a desire to make things easier. And just like that, the name someone had carried for generations, spoken by grandparents, whispered over cribs, etched into village graves, was replaced with something shorter, flatter, more American. Sometimes it was a single letter dropped. Sometimes the spelling was altered. Sometimes an entire identity was lost. And though history tends to mythologize Ellis Island as a place of grandeur and welcome, for many, it was the place where something slipped quietly, permanently out of reach. A name, misspelled, mistranslated, misremembered. The welcome was real, but it was often written. Between 1892 and 1954, more than 12 million people passed through Ellis Island. Each was documented names, ages, origins, occupations, health, conditions, all transcribed by clerks trying to keep pace with the tide of human movement. They worked fast. They worked in unfamiliar languages. They worked under pressure, and their pens decided what someone would be called in their new life. Contrary to legend, Ellis Island officers didn't officially change names as part of a deliberate policy. The manifests were filled out abroad at the port of departure by shipping company clerks. Those names were based on passports, if available, or verbal reports from travelers who often couldn't read or write. But once they reached New York, everything was reinterpreted. A Polish man named Wojciechowski might become Wojciech. An Italian woman named Giuseppina might be recorded as Josephine. A Russian Jew named Zizzle Feldman might be listed as Celia Freeman. Intentions varied. Some clerks assumed they were being helpful, shortening names for practicality. Others guessed at spellings from thick accents and trembling voices. Some passengers were too tired, too afraid, or too uncertain to correct them. And some simply gave up trying to explain. The results were permanent, because once the name was written on the record, it was the name you carried, for school, for work, for marriage, for everything, even if it wasn't really yours. There's a story passed down in a Ukrainian family about a man named Mikhailo Rinkovich. His wife and child were listed with him on the ship Manifest. But when they arrived, the officer wrote it down as Michael Green. He didn't argue. He was afraid he'd be turned away. And so, Michael Green, he became. For the next 50 years, he worked under that name, died under that name, was buried under that name only decades later when his grandchildren visited his village in Ukraine. Did they learn what the name had been and how it had been pronounced? It had been lost in it by violence, not by law, but by ink. For many immigrants, names were more than identity, okay? They were memory, geography, a connection to the dead, okay? To drop them felt like betrayal, but to keep them often meant hardship. A name that sounded too foreign could block you from a job, from a loan, from a neighborhood, from safety. So some changed their names themselves, voluntarily, quietly, to survive. But even then, this was not without loss. One man from Hungary, originally Laszlo Pastor, changed his name to Louis Pastor after being refused interviews due to his accent. Years later, he told his son, "I traded my father's name for bread." And the son, now American-born, wept because even decades later, still hurt. What's strange is how easily this was forgotten for generations. American families have recited versions of the story. They changed our name at Ellis Island. We're called something else, but they couldn't spell it. My grandmother didn't know how to explain it, so they picked something close. Some of these stories are true, some are half true, some are mythologized, retellings shaped by time and longing. But the pattern is clear. A country eager to welcome, but not always ready to listen. And names, those first gifts given at birth, became casualties of the crossing, casualties of speed, of fear, of fatigue, and of a system more interested in processing people than in knowing them. There are old ledgers stored in archives, now handwritten names in fading ink, each with a story behind it. Most of those stories will never be told because the people who lived them learned to live with the new spelling, the new sound, the new silence around who they once were. They tucked the old names into drawers, sometimes into middle initials, sometimes into recipes, sometimes into lullabies no one else understood, because a name, once changed, doesn't vanish. It echoes in ways even they didn't expect. Asterisk. The children didn't ask where their names came from. They learned them as they were short, clean, Americanized. O'Malley instead of Wymail, Ketroff instead of Petrovsky, Gold instead of Goldberg. They saw the names on school rosters, on job applications, on draft cards. They memorized how to spell them, okay? They never asked what had been left behind, because their parents rarely said, not out of shame, not even out of loss, but because there was no room for explanation. Life moved too quickly. Rent had to be paid. Factories opened at dawn. There were mouths to feed. And learning English came before remembering vowels dropped on a dock. Some parents tried to preserve fragments. A letter saved from home. A family Bible tucked in a drawer. An accent that clung to certain words, despite every effort to shake it. But the new names took hold, and the old names once whispered in tenement kitchens, or written on the backs of photos, began to fade. There is a peculiar grief in not knowing what your name once was. A man in Chicago, third-generation Polish American, once said, "I sign my name every day. I filed taxes with it. I carved it into a tree once, and I still don't know what it really was." He had tried to trace it, looked through manifests, wrote to archives, found fragments, similar names, similar ages, but nothing certain, because the misspelling wasn't just a matter of error, it became law, once recorded in an official document. The new name followed you, in school records, in military service, in death certificates. To question it was to question everything tied to it, and so most DIDs in quotes, they moved on. The irony is that many, The names were never difficult to begin with. Clerks simply didn't ask how to spell them. They guessed. They simplified. They swapped letters for sounds that fit better in English mouths. And if the person at the desk was too tired to argue or too frightened, tame, the version written down became the version remembered. There are stories of people correcting the clerk, only to be told it's good enough. Worse, it doesn't matter. But it did matter to them, and to the generations that came after children who grew up with surnames that didn't quite make sense, who later felt an echo of something missing, something softened, something incomplete. One woman, born in 1942, didn't learn her family's original Russian name until she was 6-7. It had been changed on the manifest. Her grandfather never mentioned it. Her father had never asked. She discovered it in a photocopied birth certificate from Minsk. She said, "It felt like finding my real face in a mirror I didn't know I'd lost." And then there were the names that weren't just changed, but replaced entirely. A child fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe, sent alone on a ship with no papers, might arrive with only a name spoken aloud. The clerk might write something completely different. A boy named Abram Leib might become Albert Lewis. A girl named Shando Bhatia might become Sarah Beth. And when they grew up, they tried to explain where they came from. No one believed them because their documents said otherwise. A name, once changed, becomes a kind of silence. You stop saying where it came from. You stop correcting the spelling. You stop wondering why it feels too small for you. And instead, you'll learn to fit into it, even if it fits like a borrowed coat. Sometimes families tried to reverse the change. They added letters back, corrected pronunciation, tried to reclaim what had been filed down, but often they met resistance. Teachers insisted on the simplified version. Employers printed the wrong name on checks. Neighbors mispronounced it until the correction felt rude. So the name stayed changed in the silence around. It deepened, but in that silence, a kind of resilience, because even if the spelling was lost, the stories remained, passed in low voices, not written, but remembered in sayings, in songs, in the way soup was made, the way hands were folded during prayer, in the way someone said yes without using the word. The name was gone, but the person was not. And sometimes, when their children and grandchildren looked hard enough, they found traces on old trunks, in family cemeteries, in immigration records, buried under dust. They found pieces of themselves, misspelled. Maybe, but still there, waiting, asterisk. They were trying to write names. But what they wrote was memory, and memory, when bent by haste, turns into something stranger than forgetting, because forgetting is clean. This was messier. The clerks at Ellis Island, at Castle Garden before it, and at ports from Baltimore to Boston, none of them meant to erase people. They meant to register them, to process them, to keep the line moving. But in doing so, they left behind a map made of mistakes, and generations walked that map, looking for pieces of themselves. Some found them misspelled, abbreviated, translated into sounds more familiar to American ears. Others didn't. Some names became jokes. Others became myths, and in the absence of certainty, people made up stories to fill the gaps. We were once these something nobles. Maybe. They chopped off the end of our name because it sounded too German. My grandfather said we were Smiths for safety. These stories weren't always true, but they weren't lies either. They were ways of holding on to something invisible, because how do you explain the loss of something you never knew you had? And yet, for all the mistakes, all the changes, all the names lost and found and guessed something remained. People carried the weight of those names even as the spellings changed. A name shortened isn't it's life shortened. It's a shift, a direction, taken in a hurry, but not a vanishing dot. In neighborhoods across America, especially in New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, you can still hear the echoes. A polished name ending in ski that used to end in UX, a Greek name that dropped half its vowels, a Chinese name reordered to fit Western formats, a Jewish name softened for safety, an Italian name trimmed so it could fit in a single box on a form, and still, the people behind them endured, worked, cooked, prayed, fought, loved, raised children, and sometimes whispered the old names at night when no one was around to misunderstand. There is a monument at Ellis Island, now Wall of Names. It lists over 700,000 surnames of immigrants gathered through family submissions. Some are original, some are altered, some are guessed. Many are exactly as they were first written, errors and all. It is a record, not a precision, a bit of passage, of people who stepped off ships and said their names and were given back something close, so something entirely different. And they carried those names into cities, into fields, into churches, into courtrooms, to war, and into silence, because the names may have been changed,